Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Nick King. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm going to be chairing our session over the next hour or so. Thanks very much to you all for joining us for this, the launch of the new Centre for Policy Studies report, A Northern Big Bang, which we produce alongside the Northern Research Group of MPs. Myself and Jake Berry have been the lead authors on this report, and I'm delighted that Jake has joined us today to introduce the report and tell you a bit more about what it's about. I'll ask him to do that in just a minute, and after Jake's spoken, I'll then delve into some of the specifics of the report in a bit more depth. After that, I'll ask our other panellists, Dehenna Davison, the MP for Bishop Auckland, and Glenn Bemment from Lloyds Banking Group to make some remarks. We're particularly grateful to Lloyds Banking Group for their support for this project, and I'm really looking forward to what Glenn has to say. Thanks for joining us, Glenn. I'm grateful to all the panellists for attending. I'm grateful to everybody who's registered to attend this session on Zoom and those who haven't registered but are watching it live on YouTube. In the second half of our hour together, I'll be coming to the audience for questions. So I'd ask that anybody who's got a question for the panel puts it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. Equally, if you're watching on YouTube, please address any questions to us on Twitter and we'll make sure they're put to the panelists as well. But before that, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to offer some initial thoughts on the topic, starting with Jake. Jake needs no introduction on this topic, really. He was the first, and I fear perhaps also the last, Minister of State for the Northern Powerhouse whilst in government, and he also had responsibility for local growth for a number of years. More recently, he's established the Northern Research Group to ensure the voice of the North is properly heard by those in government, including the Prime Minister, whose leadership campaign Jake was one of the main protagonists on. Over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. And for those of you who follow politics, you will have picked up a growing spirit of restlessness and radicalism across the north of England in recent years. But for us who are Northerners, it's nothing new. From the establishment of non-conformism in religious terms and the creation of the Rugby Football League, we have always had a desire to be masters of our own destiny. I believe it's that spirit that drove the vote of many people in the north of England to vote to leave the European Union back in 2016. But there wasn't just a feeling of otherworldliness in Brussels. It was reflected by a feeling of being out of touch and otherworldliness in Westminster as well. And that feeling that Westminster wasn't listening, I also believe drove the 2019 general election result. For the first time in living memory, people across the Redwood constituencies in the north of England voted Conservative. They felt that after years, they had been neglected by their poor Labour members of Parliament, and in many cases, their even poorer Labour councils. And the Blair-Brown years had seen an increase in the north-south divide. In fact, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair simply managed decline across the north of England rather than having a radical plan to increase our prosperity. I think for some time, there's been a growing feeling across the north that those in Westminster who are responsible for collecting our taxes and spending our money have had no real plan to improve our lives. But 2019 was a watershed. People across the north of England backed the Prime Minister's compelling vision to level up. But our report today wants to talk about how we can deliver real change and make it rapid. The government owes it to Northern voters. It has to find a way to rapidly change people's lives and repay their trust that they put in the government back at that election. And that's why our report calls for a Northern Big Bang. Now cast your mind back, if you can, to the 26th of October 1986. That was one day when Margaret Thatcher's government deregulated and changed the tax regime affecting the City of London. In a decade, it took the city from a regionally significant financial centre to one of the global leaders in the liquidity market. But unfortunately, Margaret Thatcher's Big Bang focused on one sector. In fact, it focused simply on one area of our country. So unlike that Big Bang, which merely supported the city and people who lived in London and the southeast, the Big Bang we are advocating will level up the whole of the United Kingdom with the north at its head. And just like 1986 was the right time for Margaret Thatcher and her government to release the potential of the City of London, now is the right time for Boris Johnson's government to release the potential of the north of England. We already stand at the vanguard of the green industrial revolution. But by following the proposals set out in this report and working smartly, the government can make sure that we lead the world. And let's be clear, Nick and I, when we were working on this report, wanted to make sure that we didn't just focus on problems. Yes, absolutely, it highlights the inequality between the North and South. Yes, it acknowledges that there's a rigged government system that will always see government investment favoured to the south of England. And yes, it talks about how the COVID crisis has affected the north of England much more severely than any other part of our country. But it's not a report focused on the problems, it's one that talks about bold solutions. So let's talk about one, planning. It's clear to me, as someone who's lived and worked in the north of England for my entire life, that our planning system here in the United Kingdom, when it comes to industry and commerce, simply isn't fit for purpose. It doesn't work. And to highlight that, I'm going to talk about one application. West Cumbria Mining is a controversial plan to build a new metallurgical coking mine in the north of England. It's been ongoing for over 4.5 years, and still, we learned just a few weeks ago, is not to be determined. It isn't environmental concerns that will ultimately mean this project doesn't go ahead. It is delay and uncertainty. And in the north of England, we are very keen, in a clean and green way, to have those 2,000 jobs in West Cumbria and the £1.8 billion it is predicted to add to our economy. And that's why a northern Big Bang, as set out in this report, would strip away a lot of those problems we see in planning. For any applications creating over 250 jobs, we want to ensure that the company has the ability to apply to an upper tier authority to get their permission quickly. And that includes, by the way, applying directly to government for major infrastructure and commercial developments. For smaller applications creating 100 jobs, we want to ensure that those permissions are given within 2 months. That doesn't mean we're going to rip up the planning system. It doesn't mean we're going to ignore environmental concerns. All of those will be dealt with, but crucially, you will get your decision quickly, making the north of England a far more attractive place to invest. The north of England for far too long has been in the waiting room for prosperity. And now is the time that we can start to release the potential of our economy. We saw it with Big Bang 1. That created some of the most competitive regulation and taxation systems in the world for the City of London. And guess what? It worked. The City of London became a global leader in finance. But we're saying with Big Bang 2, let's do the same for industry and manufacturing and the prime capability of the North's economy. In fact, if you read the report, you'll see that we have one of the worst taxation systems, the least competitive in the world for industry and manufacturing. So we're saying quickly, let's go from the worst to the best. And the worst of all these taxes that we have against industry is something we call the factory tax. It's the most pernicious and it stops investment in the north of England. And that's why we're talking for something that Nick will talk about in detail called full expensing. And we're also saying that if we have to focus on one sector, this should focus on the green industrial revolution and green collar jobs across the north of England. It is an area where the north of England already leads the world, but we know with the right tax and regulation regime, we can create the north as a global landing pad for capital that is going to drive this industrial revolution. By making the changes we suggest in this report, we predict that we will release billions of pounds of investment into the north of England and more widely into Britain's economy. And that's why finally I wanted to tell you why the Northern Research Group has backed this report. This report has been co-authored by Nick and myself, but Northern MPs like Dehenna Davison, who we have on our call today, have been a huge input into making this report a reality. It's because Northern MPs want rapid change. We will match, measure for measure, pound for pound, the radicalism and ambition of our voters. Because we know when they sent us back to Westminster in 2019 with that record Conservative majority, they did it on the basis that we work for them. We proudly support Boris Johnson, his vision and his government, but we never forget who we work for. And it's only by having a Northern Big Bang that we can release the potential for all of us who live here in the north of England. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. That's brilliant. Really inspirational words there. I was particularly struck by your comment that efforts have been made in this regard before, and they've been unsuccessful. Basically, successive governments, but particularly over those Labour years. And I'd love to probe that a bit further later on in the Q&A about what mistakes you think were made and what we can learn from that. So, okay, I'd just like to take the liberty of taking the audience through some of the details of the report in a little bit more depth. But before I do that, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure working with Jake and members of the Northern Research Group on this topic, which is obviously a matter which is politically very important, but I think also personally very important for a lot of the people who've worked on it. And it's a matter that's close to our hearts, because we're from the north and believe in the north, and think that, as Jake suggests, in certain respects it's been overlooked for too long, and policy levers haven't been pulled that perhaps should have been pulled. And it just seems so unjust that so much of the investment, the opportunities and the growth in this country gets sucked to London and the greater southeast. And as we say in the report, the North's economy measured by GVA per capita is 3/4 the size of England's average. And amazingly, that means that the GVA per capita in 2017 in every single part of the country was lower than it was in London in the year 2000. As a result of that, wages and household incomes are higher in London too. Average earnings in London are 1.5 times what they are in the northeast of England. So more and more talent gets sucked to London, which means more companies base themselves there, which means that that's where the jobs are and the opportunities. And to make matters worse, more public investment goes into London and the southeast than any other part of England, making the gap even wider. And this self-reinforcing cycle just continues and continues, which is why the levelling up agenda is so important, because it demonstrates that there's a government that's willing and ready to break this cycle. But how do we break it? Well, Jake's obviously been working on this issue for some time whilst in government and outside of government, and it's a topic that we've focused on before at the CPS, writing a report a couple of years ago called A Rising Tide. And that report looks at some of the building blocks which the government would need to focus on if it was going to be able to level up the economy, such as devolution, skills policy, and most importantly, how we can get more investment into those places which need it most. And it's that last topic which we've really majored on in this report, A Northern Big Bang. As Jake suggests, we've taken the Big Bang of the 1980s as our inspiration. It had a transformative effect across the economy of London and the southeast. So our starting point was trying to consider what could have that same sort of transformative effect in the north. And the conclusion we reached is that it's only really the private sector that can provide the scale and the speed of investment needed to take the economy forward in the way that we envisage. So that's what we focused on. It's not to say that government investment like the Levelling Up Fund and the Shared Prosperity Fund aren't important. They're really important. It's just that government investment can only do so much. So instead, we've come up with a set of recommendations which we think could unlock the private sector funding, which is so important. And those recommendations break down into 5 broad areas. The first of those is getting more private capital into infrastructure. Specifically, we recommend the creation of a new Northern Infrastructure Bond, which will be targeted at domestic and global investors and encourage them to invest in Northern infrastructure. In particular, there's an opportunity to update the rules around UK pension funds to allow them to more easily invest in long-term infrastructure projects. Daily reporting means that some funds have to over-index on highly liquid assets, but infrastructure can provide long-term guaranteed returns, and we will benefit from having more UK pension fund investment focused on the UK generally and on the North specifically. And that's what the Northern Infrastructure Bond would look to unlock. The second area is focused on increasing business investment, something which Jake's already touched upon. We know that the UK has the lowest investment into capital assets of any G7 country, and that's in large part because of the way that that sort of investment is treated in the tax system, where you're limited as to how much you can write off against corporation tax. That issue particularly affects the North with its strong manufacturing base, and it drags down productivity and growth. We therefore think that the government should introduce full expensing, where businesses can write off 100% of their investment in any one financial year. The Centre for Policy Studies has done a lot of work on full expensing in the past, and we remain convinced that this will be the best approach for a nationwide application of it. But if the Treasury are worried about its implications or its cost, we think that they should instead introduce a time-limited full expensing scheme across the north of England. This will not only allow them to test the system, but will also produce a short, sharp burst of investment into northern businesses. The third area is around brand new investment into the North's economy, and the ideas here are the most radical in the report. Using concepts like free ports and the steps taken by the Thatcher government to encourage Nissan to invest in Sunderland as our cue, we suggest a new time-limited initial investment incentive. This incentive, or the triple I as we call it, would be time-limited, would offer a government incentive of up to 10% of the capital costs for any new qualifying investment in the North. If there was appetite for the policy, but concerns it might prove too expensive, we'd suggest targeting it at net zero investments, believing, as we do, that the North is the best place to take forward the green industrial revolution that the Prime Minister has promised. The fourth area is around planning. Jake talked you through our planning reforms, where we want to introduce optionality and fast-track approaches for developments of a certain size, so that commercial developers can get the certainty they need as soon as possible. And our final area is around northern empowerment. In terms of making people in the North masters of their own destiny, we recommend the introduction of a new Northern Recovery Bond, which could be invested in by individual investors in the North and institutional investors alike. Given that there's over £200 billion of additional savings collected over the last 12 months, according to the Bank of England, and there's huge cash reserves which many institutional investors are sitting on, we think that there's a deluge of investment ready to be unlocked and invested into the northern economy. In fact, that goal, unleashing investment across the North, is the basic ambition of the whole report. Some of these ideas are pretty radical, they haven't been tried before, but what has been tried clearly hasn't worked. If we're going to have a northern big bang, we're going to have to do things differently, and that's what this report is all about. So that's a quick canter through the various elements of the report. I'd like to now go to our other two panelists, starting with Dehenna Davison to offer some remarks either on the report itself or more generally the climate for investment in the North. Dehenna made history in 2019 at the general election by becoming the first ever Conservative MP for Bishop Auckland in its 140 year history. Since being elected, she's not been backwards in coming forward, and she's taken up leadership roles with the China Research Group, the Blue Collar Conservatives, and the Northern Policy Foundation. She's a doughty champion for the North, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Dehenna.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for having me along for the launch of this really, really vital report. I mean, a lot of what Jake said there, I would completely agree with in terms of what our voters in the North expect from government. And basically, they expect us to really deliver on levelling up. And we know that levelling up in itself is a vague concept, but to give you an idea of what I think it means, I think it's making sure that, you know, whether you're a kid born in Bath or in Birkenhead, you've got opportunities to get a decent education, to get a really good, highly skilled job, and you don't feel you need to move away to a big southern city in order to do that. And I think some of the measures outlined in this report will go a really long way to helping us get there. It's going to be a long-term project. I don't think any of us will shy away from that fact. But there are a few things in the report that I'd kind of really like to touch upon and throw my full support behind. So Jake went down the planning route, but based on my past job, I'm going to go down the sort of capital expenditure route instead. I used to work for an accountancy firm and did a lot around encouraging business investment, around research and development work. And so the amount of times I would look at a set of accounts, look at those capital expenditure figures and go, whoa, then actually, when I did a bit more research, realized that in terms of other kind of incentives with other nations around the world, ours are not actually that generous. So, for example, there was some research done that's actually featured there in the report, outlining that I think the US-based tax foundation shows that the UK is ranked 33rd out of 36 countries surveyed in terms of its capital allowances. UK cost recovery average of 57%, the OECD average of 68.6%. We really need to do better to encourage those businesses to invest. So I think the idea set out in the report there about having 100% return on capital expenditure for a sort of time limited period, specifically for the North, is something that will go down incredibly well and encourage that investment. But when you then add that to the idea of the initial investment incentive, the triple I, as Nick just called it, I think this could be a really good, positive, and for Treasury, in the grand scheme of things, not very costly way of actually encouraging businesses to invest. And we talk about that investment, but what is the point of it? Well, the point of it is so that they can invest in their processes, grow their businesses, take on more workers, hopefully in very highly skilled areas, and give people right across our constituencies, across the North and across the former Red Wall, a good chance of getting a decent job and providing for their families. And that's what we always need to bring this back to. I think sometimes when we talk about levelling up as a concept, we forget to think about the real human side of it and what it means for individuals. But it's measures like this, real practical measures that could be introduced by government, specifically for the North, that could have a really solid impact for people on the ground, for themselves and for the kind of outcomes for their families. So really delighted to throw my weight behind this report, and I'm really grateful to both Jake and to the CPS for having me along today.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Dehenna. Our final speakers, Bemment from the Lloyds Banking Group. We're really grateful to Lloyds for their support for this project, and Glenn for joining us today. Glenn's the commercial director for the Northern Region Lloyds Banking Group, and he oversees plans for SME and for big corporate banking. He's also a member of the Lloyds Ambassador Group for the North of England and North West Business Leaders. So Glenn, looking forward to what you've got to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. The first real thank you is to you, Nick, really. Lloyds Banking Group are absolutely delighted to be involved and supported you and the Centre for Policy Studies in releasing the Big Bang report that you've just touched upon. We think it's really timely and a really important contribution to the ongoing debate in regionalisation, regeneration and levelling up with the North. As someone who's worked in my career for the last 2 decades in banking, in finance, in the North, something I'm really passionate about. So while Lloyds are a national organisation, we are really strong and proud of our heritage in the North. We've been supporting industries in the North for a long time now, in some big industries around shipbuilding, coal, cotton, etc., to more modern day industries and services. And we're really proud of our support in financing some of these businesses, both pre the COVID pandemic and during the COVID pandemic. But also through that funding, we've provided businesses with the opportunities to grow and invest within the Northern region, and clearly within other regions of the UK and in overseas market. And I think that will be key to some of the regeneration, regionalisation work we talk about here today. So you'll hear more about this later from Lloyds Banking Group. But in 2021, our focus will be on helping Britain recover from the pandemic. We've provided a range of financial support for businesses to access during the pandemic, and I think our role will be both practical and financial as the economy builds a head of steam and begins to recover. But our economic research within Lloyds Banking Group and some of our conversations we've had with clients and business leaders tells us that that will not be an easy route. We know it will be difficult, and we know it will be difficult in certain towns and places and sectors that have perhaps been more impacted by the COVID pandemic than others. More reason for this report that we could actually see more disparity within regions in the North of England. The recent Lloyds Bank barometer pointed out some views around confidence levels, and while we've had a recent dip in business confidence through pandemic, there is light at the end of the tunnel. some of those confidence levels have started to rebound in our most recent report in January. And there's definitely a sense that the optimism around vaccine rollouts is perhaps slightly outweighing the concerns, the business concerns around the risks of the new variants. I think the final comment I'd say is that, you know, this isn't the only report we've been involved in. We commissioned our own conversation in 2020 entitled The Big Conversation, recognising that Lloyds Banking Group certainly didn't have all the answers to regeneration in the region and answers to the COVID pandemic. We had a 3-month series of conversations with, say, a number of clients, businesses, business leaders, industrialists, that really prompted a debate about what is it that they need to support to Britain to recover. And I guess the key punchline from that, Nick, the summary was that one size will not fit all. I think that's clear and evident to everyone on this panel and everyone listening. But introducing strategies, plans, incentives to help regionalisation and regeneration in the north will be an absolute kickstart to the northern economy, and to unlock the undoubted talent, you know, entrepreneurship, skills, capability that exists now, and with our world-leading, you know, universities and research centres, you know, industries for the future, particularly as we build back greener and more sustainable. You know, this is, in my mind, is one in a lifetime opportunity for people to really think about what economy we want to build back better towards. So I'll just close, Nick, before I hand back to you, that, you know, as I said in my opening remarks, the north is really important for our businesses and our clients, but also as an employer. You know, we have a significant number of employees that are based and work in the north, you know, as we are part of the communities that, you know, need to build back better and to recover in 2021 and beyond.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Dave, you want to just Thank you. Thanks very much for those remarks and thought-provoking stuff. I'll come back with some questions, if I may. We've had lots of questions coming in already for the audience. Thank you ever so much. Please do keep them coming in the Q&A box. I'll try and limit my questions just to 1 and 2, so we've got as much time as possible to get through those. Really interesting set of remarks. I'm interested, we unusually in some respects didn't talk too much about COVID, which is often, you know, the first topic of conversation at times like this. Jenna, you were obviously elected before that pandemic struck, but didn't have too long in the House of Commons before it did strike, and it's obviously been, you know, a difficult year for lots of people in lots of respects. I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on COVID-19 and the implications of that for the levelling up agenda, whether it's made it harder or easier or more urgent or less urgent. Where do you think we are a year on post-pandemic?
Thanks, Nick. I think it's a kind of really important question. And I must admit, you know, when you first get elected, you do not expect to be hit smack bang in the face with a global pandemic and all the pressures that puts on you. So it has been a challenge. But in terms of the levelling up agenda, I think, if anything, it has made it even more urgent that we really get this right, that we really kind of, as we emerge from COVID and come up with, you know, whatever schemes of recovery we come up with, that we use it as an opportunity to really rebalance our economy regionally, for all the reasons that you outlined earlier, in terms of many ways in which the North has kind of fallen behind in recent decades. And I think even more urgent in the sense that we've seen lots of evidence now to suggest that the pandemic itself has actually hit the North harder. So it's a bit of a double whammy. But certainly, I think government's kind of very aware of that, and very aware that we're going to have to be quite creative and ambitious as we move forward in order to get this right. So really incredibly urgent. And I think that creativity is the key point. I think often with policy making, we tend to tweak around the edges. But as kind of Jake highlighted earlier in his remarks about the Thatcher years, tweaking around the edges isn't going to be what is going to really revolutionise the kind of regional inequalities and really fix that. We're going to have to be really bold. And I think it's kind of measures like those in the report that you've outlined today that can really be a good starting point for us to set out that really bold agenda to really make a difference for the people right across the North.
Brilliant, thank you. And that I'd like to just explore that theme a little bit more. And Jake, when we were first talking about this, you were very clear that you wanted this to be a radical set of proposals, and we weren't tinkering around the edges. I'd love your sort of reflections on what we can learn from efforts in this regard in the past, because this isn't the first government that said this is important and a priority. It was a big feature of the Labour government for 13 years. Cameron talked about rebalancing, Osborne talked about rebalancing, launched Northern Powerhouse, Midlands Engine. So what is it that didn't happen then that you think does need to happen now, and if we are going to succeed in this agenda?
Thanks, Nick. Well, what I'd say is, first of all, we are coming out of a global pandemic. I, for one, hope that I never see another one in my lifetime. But it sort of wipes the slate clean, as it were. And it's brilliant the government talks about building back better. But of course, for many in the north of England, we want to build back differently. Where we started from, we weren't happy with. We weren't happy with the inequality, with the rigged system in favour of London. We want things to change. And a good way of thinking about how we can deliver that change is, of course, to look back at what's happened in the past. And I would say lots of the government initiatives and proposals, from the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, to other things by Labour governments, they simply just haven't had the scale of ambition that Northern voters are now demanding from the government. And frankly, government as usual will not cut it, because people across the north of England want to see rapid change. And I think that's why lots of these proposals, which, I'm sure there's someone in the Treasury who spat their cornflakes out onto their desk, or wherever they're working from home at the moment, spat their cornflakes out when they read this report and say, crikey, that's radical, that sounds expensive, that will change things. Well, that's exactly what we want. We want things to change. And it's only by embracing that spirit of radicalism, which is embodied and epitomised by Northerners and Northern voters, and has been for generations and decades and centuries, that we will deliver real change in this country. And if you take the Levelling Up Fund, just briefly, it's hugely welcome. It's £4 billion invested across England. But it compares very badly with the money that's been attracted to Greater Manchester from places like Abu Dhabi and China, which in total is over £6 billion into one city. These changes will create the north of England as a global landing pad for capital. And that doesn't just mean for business, because in Greater Manchester, those money invested by the UAE are going to deliver 6,000 affordable homes. The sort of rapid change we want to see, a more inclusive growth agenda, where people are able to have those high value jobs in the long term, can't be delivered by government on its own. So we need to set the environment in which global capital and national capital will co-invest with government to deliver real change.
Fantastic, thanks, Jake. As I say, we've got plenty of questions coming in from the audience, and do please keep them coming. I'm going to start, if I may, by inviting John Redwood, who's put a couple of questions in, to take his get his video on and take his audio muted off if he's around. Put the question to the panel directly if he's able, and if he's not, I will ask it on his behalf. But John, if you're with us, please do that. Okay, I will ask it on his behalf. He's actually put two questions, and
it's all right. Can you now hear me?
Yep, we can. Thank you, John.
It took a little while because you were obviously controlling my mute, so I wasn't able to unmute it immediately. Well done. Yes, absolutely right. As someone who has in the past run industrial businesses in the north, Darlington rolling mills, ceramic tile works in Stoke and so forth, I'm a great believer in the capability for northern industry. But I think one of the things that came across to me with those businesses was that in the local communities, we just lacked the critical mass of entrepreneurs and small businesses offering the extra services and the components and the other things that we'd have liked to have bought locally, but you often ended up buying them from somewhere else. And so it seems to me the government as a whole has got to do a much better job at making it easier for people to set up in small businesses, to offer contracts to larger companies, to be part of that integrated supply chain instead of rushing for the import from abroad or the London answer in the case of services. And so I would like to see the government just get rid of an awful lot of taxes and impositions on the self-employed and small businesses. I think the Treasury is very anti-enterprise and it's making it more difficult. I think that'd be great for the North. And the other thing I always needed as an industrialist was loads of cheap energy. And this country is becoming very uncompetitive on cheap energy. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because the single policy I would have for reindustrializing is loads of cheap energy.
Thank you, John. If I may, I'll turn that first point into a question for Glenn about his reflections really on the landscape for small businesses across the north of England, whether there are notable gaps from your point of view, and whether there are gaps or not, whether or not the government is doing enough to encourage that sort of entrepreneurship that the north really needs.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for your reflections there, John. So I'd say a couple of things on that, Nick. So I mentioned in my opening remarks the conversations we've been having with clients and businesses, etc. Those conversations took place in the northwest, in Yorkshire, in the Humber, and in the northeast. You know, the three major regions of the north. By and large, they told us the same thing, and some of the key messages were that since the COVID pandemic, that in excess of 40% of small, medium, and mid-corporate businesses found themselves more innovative, driven by the need to pivot their business operations, look for new markets, drive new revenues, etc. And in excess of 25% of those same businesses also believe their business was more resilient. So if we think about productivity and regionalisation, I think in some ways you can look at this through some rose-tinted glasses, that the COVID pandemic has accelerated entrepreneurship, innovation and resilience, but clearly there's lots of businesses that don't feel like that. So and also speaking to business owners locally, I think this sense of place has become really quite important to business owners, managers, entrepreneurs, that where they can, they would dearly like to support local supply chains. I think one of the challenges there is knowing who's on your doorstep and making sure that those SMEs, survive the COVID pandemic, are still in business, thrive, and are there to be the supply chain of the larger businesses that sit and operate and employ, people in our northern community. So I'd say in summary, it's definitely about innovation, definitely about resilience, and we know that business in Britain is extremely entrepreneurial, but it needs to be supported with maybe some of the comments that you've made in your report.
Thanks, Glenn.
And
Jay, perhaps you could comment on the energy point that Sir John makes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for Sir John sort of taking part and listening to us today. No, we absolutely agree that affordable energy must be a priority, and that's why the report specifically looks about how we can cut the cost of delivering new green energy. And clearly one of the ways of cutting the cost of energy is to remove significant tranches of taxation that apply to that sector already, and particularly discourage the innovation and manufacturing being based in the north of England to get that green energy online. But I also just wanted to pick up on the clustering point as well, because here in Lancashire, we have one of the largest aerospace clusters in the world. The hub of that clearly is BAE Systems, with its work building the F-35 and the Eurofighter. But we have seen an entire industry come around BAE to work with them on the supply chain. So I would suggest that the best way of having a local supply chain is create the opportunity and the incentive to invest, and then probably for the government to get out of the way and let businesses get on doing what they're good at, which is running good businesses, and allow the cluster to come around. And we know clustering works. We can see it in aerospace, in nuclear energy, in the green energy industry. But in order to get those clusters, you have to have that kingpin manufacturer located in an area first, and that's what we want to do by some of the proposals in this report.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks so much for joining us today, Sir John. I've got a sort of selection of questions here, which are all to do with, I suppose, the softer side of things, rather than a deluge of private sector investment. So firstly, we've got, I'm going to come to you with this if that's okay, Dehenna. Firstly, we've got Rayhan Hack pointing out that 225 of the left behind areas in the country are areas where the community is deprived and there's high community needs around civic engagement and community activity, and asks therefore what we might be able to do to help build social infrastructure. On a similar theme, there's questions from Sophie de Schwartzberg-Gunther, who asks about whether there's more that we can be doing on early years education. And another question from Marta pointing out that it's all well and good talking about investment, but we really need a healthy workforce in order to make sure that the northern economy is in robust a shape as possible. So I guess the question really, Dehenna, is do we think we're sort of missing a trick by focusing on these really important economic levers and not doing enough on the social side of things?
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to the three people mentioned for their questions. I'll try and touch on a few bits. I mean, you know, in order to really kind of get the most out of an area, it does have to be a combination of economic and social levers. I think we can all probably agree on that. The social stuff, though, I mean, obviously, we have to get basics right. We have to make sure that the NHS is providing adequate treatment, that people are able to access that free of charge at the point of delivery, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in terms of other schemes, it's something that has to be done in partnership with public and private sector. You know, we see examples of businesses working together with local volunteers to come up with, I don't know what it could be. It could be, you know, childcare groups. It could be, you know, things like investment into public spaces and green areas, and, you know, businesses donating bulbs so that local villages can come together and make it look a little bit prettier. I think there's a lot of joint working there that absolutely has to be done. But from my perspective, I still think that the kind of best thing that we can do is really introduce a really good series of economic levers, because I think, you know, again, it comes down to the quality of life that we want people to have. And, you know, generally, it's pretty well noted that if someone is in a decent, high-skilled, well-paid job, they are more likely to lead a kind of more comfortable and probably healthier lifestyle. So I think that's one of the key points, making sure that those opportunities are available. But certainly, the point made by the person who asked the first question is exactly right. Those left behind areas do rely an awful lot on that level of community support. But I think we certainly need to look at how both public and private sectors can work together to deliver that in the best, most effective way, and the best, most effective way for that particular local community as well. Because, yeah, sure, there are 225 left behind areas there that were mentioned in that question, but each of those will have a very kind of diverse and very specific set of needs that will vary across all of those areas. So I think those sort of decisions have to be taken at a really ultra local level, again, in partnership with public and private sector.
Thanks, Jenna. A question from Christopher, which I'll come to you with, Glenn. Christopher points out that there's a risk-averse nature to most startup investment providers. I'm sure he's not talking about Lloyds Banking Group, but he says that experience shows that typically investment doesn't flow to the true startups because they're too high risk, presumably going to safer bets who've been operating for some time. Is that something that you recognise, and do you have particular thoughts about how we might deal with that?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Nick. So what I would say is this. So first of all, Lloyds Banking Group, just to sort of show our support over the pandemic, you know, we've supported businesses with an excess of 12 billion, which is a significant amount of money, you know, since the pandemic, across a whole range of businesses, across SMEs, mid corporates, large corporates, for businesses that need that liquidity to survive, frankly. So that's not just Lloyds Banking Group, you know, clearly other banks, finances, private equity have supported the UK economy. The conversation around startups has been well trailed. You know, they are inherently, you know, carry higher risk, but there is an increasingly huge amount of resources available to businesses to make them more successful. Increasingly is a new sort of family of financing options for those types of businesses, and it might not be one of the major UK banks, but it may well be. So I think the question really is, how do we signpost people that are starting up in business to get the right support, advice, making them business ready to take on finance? And I'm sure once they're ready, there will be no end of support for people looking to support them with bank or investment capital. So I think, really it's about signposting, education, support. But the harsh reality is that, unfortunately through the pandemic, there will be some businesses that fail, as there are every year. And, Jake talked about wiping the slate clean. And unfortunately, there will be some businesses that don't make it. Equally, when you start to think about sustainability, as we build to, net zero, there will be businesses that are around today that will continue to grow and prosper and be very different in the future. And equally, some businesses that are around to serve certain markets now, thinking some of the fossil burning based industries that are really going to have to work hard. Just an interesting stat for us, in the North. The North's economy, we know from our own research, is more carbon intensive than any other region in the UK. So arguably that challenge to net zero and to longer term sustainability is much more difficult for northern based businesses compared with some other regions in the UK. So that's some additional challenge, and goes back to the real start of this conversation of why we need to think about our regions and really invest in the way that your report begins to shine a light on.
It's a really good point. And I guess the challenge for all of us is turning that challenge into an opportunity. So it's something to overcome, but if you're going to overcome it, then how are you going to restructure it in a way which allows the North to rise to that wider ambition to have the green industrial revolution and have the manufacturing and the jobs that'll improve our climate performance. Jake, you're going to come to you with a couple of questions, if that's okay, because we've got loads to get through. So one is from Keith Boyfield, who's a research fellow at the CPS, and he asks specifically around Greenbelt, and points out that a lot of land in the Northwest has been designated as Greenbelt, even though it could be best regarded as amber at best. And I don't think this is a problem that's particular to the North, but if you have any reflections on that, and if there's anything we might do. And then the other question, which comes from John Yates, and is about the sort of civic pride that's felt in northern towns in particular, and how we can make sure that the circumstances that we create aren't just about developing expertise and economic growth and performance in those major cities across the North, but also extends to the towns, which is so important across the northern economy.
Thank you, Nick, and two really important questions there. I'm going to start with the second. Let's not forget that much of the civic pride that we have in our areas was seeded by the Industrial Revolution. I can almost look out of my window and see great town halls in places like Accrington and Rawtenstall and northern Lancashire mill towns of Darwin. And a lot of that civic pride and feeling of place was built around a collective endeavour in industry. And certainly what we are seeking to do is replicate that collective endeavour and industry, not just in our cities, but across the north of England. And we've heard about the challenges with deprivation. One of the best ways of tackling deprivation, of course, is to create those highly paid and secure jobs that this report envisages could be delivered. Look, on the second issue of planning and Greenbelt, I mean, the government certainly does need to ensure that all areas have a local plan in place. We don't yet have that in many areas, including here in Rossendale and East Lancashire, where I am today. And that local plan needs to be light on its feet. It needs to recognise things like Greenbelt that has previously been developed. So, for example, you have things like former scrapyards in Greenbelt, and where it seeks to change Greenbelt, it should replicate it with high quality, pristine land. I certainly do not want to see an undermining or reduction in our Greenbelt, but I think we need a planning system that just reflects the reality of Greenbelt on the ground and enables people to develop where it is appropriate to do so, and it has local support.
Thank you, Jake. Dehenna, there's a question from Nico MacDonald, who's former CEO of the Research and Development Society, and given your former life, I thought you'd be the right person to answer this. Nico asks what the need and potential is for R&D in this big bang investment model, and asks specifically if there's anything we've learned from the National Graphene Institutes. But I think more generally, we're very grateful for your reflections on the role that R&D has to play.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Nico, for that question as well. Yeah, I mean, I worked in R&D before I came into Parliament, and it was really eye-opening seeing research and development kind of happening at businesses, not just, you know, big sort of scientific businesses, people in lab coats wearing goggles, but actually really small micro businesses as well, conducting their own research and development to improve productivity or to improve the quality of a product or whatever it might be. And I think it's actually got a really, really important role to play. You know, at the moment already government has some incentives in place like research and development tax credits, which businesses can claim back for research and development work, as well as those capital allowances. But I do think it has a really crucial role to play. And one of the things I actually found in my work was that there were so many businesses, small businesses, conducting research and development, but because it wasn't as scientific as you would expect with lab coats, etc., they didn't realize they were actually eligible for some of those government incentives. So one of my biggest kind of roles in that job was actually to kind of assess what they were doing and come back to them, not just to say, yes, you are doing R&D, but actually to say, and here's how much you could be getting back legitimately from the government to then reinvest. And what we found actually was that the vast majority of those businesses who were getting R&D tax credits back were actually reinvesting it back into their businesses. They weren't just pocketing the profits. They were putting it back in. They were improving their processes further. They were introducing new products. They were taking on more staff. And again, it comes back to that human side of more people in quality work being able to provide for their families. So I think it's got a really crucial role to play. And we have seen some really good examples, as Nico mentioned, like the Graphene Institute, who really have been incredible. And we are now kind of leading the world in that particular, I was going to say products, but I suppose that particular material and all its applications. So I still think we've got a long way to go to get the R&D climate to what it could be, and to make sure that we're really using the full potential of our kind of R&D in the UK. But yeah, a huge role to play.
Thanks, Dehenna. Another question for you, Jake, which comes from a name which might be familiar to you, Miranda Barker, Miranda, Chief Exec of the East Lancs Chamber. And she points out that there's a huge opportunity for the North to lead on the innovation around energy and low carbon, but that there's a lot of things that need to be put in place to enable that. And she references a few, talking about policy changes on procurement, landfill tax costs, EV charging capability, energy infrastructure, planning changes, carbon taxation, skills provision, etc. And then asks if government is committed to proactive policy changes at this level. So your view on how up for these sorts of things this government is, please.
Well, I think, hello, Miranda. I think if we're really serious as a government about releasing the potential of the north of England, we have to do all of those things, because levelling up, first and foremost for business, needs to be around levelling up productivity and investing in your workforce and in your premises, whether it be through new investment allowances, or whether it be through those sort of softer side of skills that the government, I hope, will make available as part of this new green industrial revolution. Is frankly the best way of driving wealth and prosperity. I think we already do it pretty well here in East Lancashire, but we want to see that grow across the entirety of the north.
Thanks, Jake. Questions come in from Piers Warburton. I'll ask this question, then after this question I'll do one more, which I'll ask you all to answer. But the question from Piers, I'll put to Dehenna, if that's okay, and it's around the potential for regional growth boards. Piers, I think I'm right in saying, has been working with the One Powerhouse consortium, which Lord Kerslake is closely involved with, and that suggests a number of regional growth boards across different parts of the country. And in this report, we've talked about the opportunity for a growth board for the north. So I'd be interested, Dehenna, in your reflections on whether or not this is something which will really make a difference, or if this is sort of moving deck chairs and having a different set of people making recommendations. And can any board like this really do anything significant when you've still got a lot of the levers sitting in SW1?
Thanks, Nick. I was concerned then. I thought you said Piers Morgan for half a second. I was like, this one could be interesting. So I think regional growth boards have an awful lot of potential. Sorry, the sunlight's got shocking in this room. But it kind of, I think, comes down a lot to the individuals who are involved in those boards, and the manner in which they can take the kind of research that they've done and take the proposals that they've come up with and really drive them forward to actually deliver for the people within those regions. I think that's the key point. But it's making sure that you've got the right movers and shakers around the table who are willing to, frankly, to go and be as mouthy as Jake is on stuff like the kind of stuff the Northern Research Group is putting out, but really making sure that there's a kind of consistency in trying to drive that forward, reaching the people who can really make those decisions and implement them to deliver for the people within those regions. So that was not a yes or a no answer. It was it depends. But certainly, I think, you know, regions know best what is right for them, the challenges they're facing, and how to emerge from those challenges. And it's just about making sure you've got the right possible steps in place, then actually deliver upon that.
Makes sense. Thank you. Well, I'm determined to finish this at 1 o'clock because I've got a poor track record of finishing these things on time. So I'm going to ask one last question to all three of the panelists, and it comes from Roger Marsh, who obviously has responsibility across the North, working with all the different LEPs. And Roger asks, within 2 decades, what would success look like for the communities of the North? His thought is that perhaps it's about being a net national contributor, but more generally, any closing remarks and a reflection on what success would look like for Northern communities. And we'll start with you, please, Glenn.
Thanks. Hi, Roger. Thanks for dialing in. I hope you're well. What a great question. So I'd sum it up that, you know, this is the place where people want to live, they'd want to work, you know, and where they want to set up business, frankly. And, you know, what would be that lasting legacy of that generation from this point forward, you know, and it wouldn't be great to be known for, you know, the most sustainable, you know, business region in Europe, you know, set ourselves something really ambitious to be known for, to work towards, and create a differential to the rest of the regions in the UK, to London, and to markets in Europe and further beyond.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Glenn. Dehenna.
Thank you. I mean, to be honest, I'd agree with much of what Glenn said there in terms of, you know, making sure that there's no area, frankly, in the North where people wouldn't want to live, where they wouldn't feel like they could get a decent job, a decent education, etc., etc. I appreciate that's abstract. It's not exactly KPIable. But for me, that's really what this is all about. And I haven't yet decided the best way to measure it properly.
Thanks, Dehenna. And Jake, final word on this?
I suppose the final word is that success in 20 years' time would mean that the success that we all have in life is more linked to our individual talent and ambition than our postcode or what job our parents had. I think that would be a real measure of success. Let's give everyone equality of opportunity wherever they live and really enable the North to lead the country in its recovery from COVID.
Thanks, Jake. Very wise words. And hopefully the recommendations and proposals in Northern Big Bang will help unlock that reality. We talk in the report about making the North one of the most investable places on the planet. If we're able to do that, we can be assured that the economy of the North will be in fine fettle in the future and the government's levelling up ambitions will be realised. But I'd just like to finish by thanking all our panelists for joining us today, everybody in the audience for participating, coming forward with so many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through them all. Particular thanks to Glenn and Lloyds Banking Group for their support for this. Dehenna, thank you ever so much for joining us. And on behalf of the CPS, I'd like to thank all the members of the Northern Research Group for your contributions to this. And particular thanks to Jake for having the idea and the inspiration and making this happen. It's a great report. We're proud of it, and we'll be taking the ideas and proposals in it to government and trying to get them taken up and adopted. So thank you all ever so much.